October 15, 1983. The bright studio lights of the late-night show with David Morrison illuminated Stage 6 at NBC's Burbank Studios as one of the most anticipated celebrity interviews of the season was about to begin. In the guest chair sat 48-year-old Alain Delon, still devastatingly handsome, still carrying himself with the magnetic presence that had made him one of the most recognizable faces in international cinema. Alain was in America to promote his latest film, Le Retour, a complex psychological drama that had been generating significant buzz at European film festivals. The American distributor was hoping that a high-profile television appearance would help introduce Alain to a broader American audience and drive box office success for what they believed could be a crossover hit. But behind the scenes, there was tension that the viewing audience would never see. 30 minutes before the show went live to 20 million American homes, producer Jack Kellerman pulled Alain aside in his dressing room for what he characterized as a friendly chat about the format. "Listen, Alan," Kellerman said, using the Americanized pronunciation of Alain's name and always made the actor wince slightly. "This is American television. Our audience is Middle America. Working people, families, folks who don't necessarily have a lot of experience with foreign films or, frankly, foreign languages." Alain listened politely, though his expression remained neutral. He had been doing interviews for over 20 years and was accustomed to various requests from producers and hosts. "What I'm getting at," Kellerman continued, "is that it would be really helpful if you could stick to English throughout the interview. Your English is excellent, much better than most of our international guests, so there shouldn't be any problem. It's just that when celebrities start speaking in foreign languages, we lose the audience. They change the channel." The request wasn't entirely unreasonable from a television production standpoint. American audiences in 1983 were far less accustomed to hearing foreign languages on mainstream television than they would become in later decades. Subtitles were virtually unheard of on talk shows, and producers lived in constant fear of losing viewers to more accessible programming. But what Kellerman didn't understand was that he wasn't just asking Alain to speak a different language. He was asking him to suppress a fundamental part of his identity. For Alain, French wasn't just a language. It was the medium through which he had learned to think, to feel, to express his deepest emotions and most complex thoughts. "I understand your concern," Alain replied in his perfect, accented English, "but you must understand that there are some thoughts that can only be properly expressed in the language in which they were first conceived." Kellerman shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this conversation wasn't going as smoothly as he had hoped. "Look, I'm not saying you can't be passionate or emotional. Just do it in English. Trust me, you'll connect better with the audience." Alain nodded politely, but he made no commitment. This would prove to be significant. The interview began smoothly enough. Host David Morrison, a skilled interviewer known for his ability to put international guests at ease, opened with questions about Alain's career, his most famous films, and his reputation as one of Europe's most celebrated actors. Alain responded graciously in English, displaying the charm and sophistication that had made him a favorite subject for journalists around the world. For the first 15 minutes, everything went exactly according to Kellerman's plan. The conversation was engaging, accessible, and perfectly suited for American television. Alain discussed his early films, his work with directors like Jean-Luc Godard and Michelangelo Antonioni, and his transition from modeling to acting. His English was not just fluent, but elegant, with the kind of accent that American audiences found sophisticated rather than foreign. But then Morrison asked a question that changed everything. "You've spent your entire career making films in Europe," Morrison said, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. "Have you ever been tempted to move to Hollywood permanently? To become, in essence, an American movie star?" The question struck something deep in Alain. It wasn't just about career choices or geographical preferences. It was about identity, about the assumption that becoming American was somehow an improvement over what he already was. "You know," Elaine began, still in English, "this is a question I am asked often, and it always puzzles me. Why would I want to become something other than what I am?" Morrison smiled, thinking he was getting good material. "Well, for the opportunities, the bigger budgets, the global audience." "But I already have a global audience," Elaine interrupted, his voice taking on a more passionate tone. "French cinema, European cinema, it speaks to the world. It doesn't need to apologize for being what it is." From the control room, Kellerman watched nervously as Elaine's responses became more animated. The actor was still speaking English, but his body language suggested he was building towards something more emotional. "I think what our viewers might be wondering," Morrison continued, "is whether there's something uniquely American about the kind of stardom that Hollywood offers, the glamour, the lifestyle." That was the moment when something shifted in Elaine's expression. Later, television analysts would point to this as the exact instant when the interview transformed from a standard celebrity promotional appearance into something much more significant. "You speak of American glamour, American lifestyle, but what about French elegance? What about European sophistication? What about the beauty of a culture that has been creating art for centuries?" Morrison, sensing that he might be losing control of the interview, tried to steer back to safer territory. "Of course, French culture is wonderful, we all admire," but Elaine wasn't finished, and this was when he made the decision that would define the entire encounter. "Non, non, non," he said, the French words emerging naturally as his passion overcame his compliance with Kellerman's directive. "You see, this is exactly what I mean. You ask me to speak of my culture, my identity, my life's work, but only in your language, only in terms you find comfortable." In the control room, Kellerman frantically gestured to Morrison to get the interview back on track. But Elaine was warming to his theme, and the French words were flowing more freely now. "Quand je parle de la France, de l'art français, de l'âme française, how can I do justice to these concepts in any language other than in the one in which they live?" Morrison, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden shift to French, tried to steer back to safer territory. "Of course, French culture is wonderful. We all admire." But that was when Elaine did something that would be talked about for decades. He turned to look directly into the camera, making eye contact with the 20 million Americans watching at home, and spoke with a clarity and intensity that cut through every television screen in the country. "Je suis français, et alors?"
5 words. 5 words that roughly translated to, "I am French, so what?" But the translation couldn't capture the full meaning, the pride, the defiance, the refusal to be diminished or asked to apologize for his identity. The studio fell completely silent. Morrison sat speechless, unsure how to respond. The studio audience, even without understanding the exact words, could feel the power and emotion behind them. Alain wasn't finished. Switching back to English, but with his French declaration still hanging in the air, he continued, "I am not here to become American. I am here to share what I am with Americans. There is a difference." The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, unexpectedly, someone in the studio audience began to applaud. The applause spread, growing from a few people to dozens, until the entire studio was giving Alain a standing ovation. Morrison, professional that he was, managed to recover enough to wrap up the interview gracefully. But everyone in that studio and millions watching at home knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. In the control room, Kellerman was torn between horror at the deviation from his instructions and recognition that they had captured something genuinely powerful on television. The switchboard was already lighting up with calls from viewers, and the early indications suggested that the response was overwhelmingly positive. The aftermath of Alain's declaration was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours, video clips of his "Je suis français et alors" moment were being played on news programs across the country. The phrase became a rallying cry not just for French Americans, but for anyone who had ever been asked to suppress their cultural identity in order to fit in. Immigration advocacy groups embraced Alain's words as a perfect encapsulation of the American paradox, a nation built by immigrants but constantly asking newcomers to abandon what made them unique. The moment became a touchstone for discussions about assimilation versus cultural preservation. French-American communities were particularly energized by Alain's stand. Cultural organizations reported a surge in membership and attendance at French-language events. The phrase "Je suis français et alors" appeared on T-shirts, bumper stickers, and posters in French neighborhoods from Louisiana to Maine. But the impact extended beyond any single ethnic community. Italian Americans, Mexican Americans, Polish Americans, people from dozens of different backgrounds saw in Alain's moment a validation of their own struggles to maintain their heritage while building lives in America. The entertainment industry took notice as well. Other international celebrities, emboldened by Alain's example, began insisting on their right to express themselves authentically in interviews, rather than conforming to simplified American expectations. Television producers, initially resistant to the idea of foreign languages on American TV, gradually began to recognize that audiences were more sophisticated than they had assumed. The success of Alain's interview helped pave the way for more culturally diverse programming in the years that followed. Film critics and cultural commentators wrote extensively about what they called the Delon moment, analyzing it as a perfect example of how authenticity could be more powerful than accessibility. The interview became required viewing in film schools and communication programs as an example of how staying true to one's identity could create a stronger connection with audiences than attempting to appeal to the lowest common denominator. Years later, when asked about the interview, Alain reflected on what had motivated his decision to switch to French at such a crucial moment. He said, "I realized that they were asking me to deny the very thing that had made my career possible. My French identity, my European sensibility, these weren't obstacles to overcome, they were the source of everything I had achieved."
The phrase "Je suis français et alors" entered the broader American cultural lexicon as a symbol of unapologetic cultural pride. It was quoted by politicians defending multiculturalism, by educators arguing for bilingual education, and by immigrants standing up to discrimination. The moment also became a case study in communication schools across the country. Professors used Alain's interview to teach students about the power of authentic communication versus manufactured accessibility. The lesson was clear. Audiences could sense when someone was being genuine, and they responded more positively to authenticity than to artificial attempts to please everyone. The impact on French language education in America was particularly notable. French teachers reported that enrollments in their classes increased significantly in the months following Alain's television appearance. Students cited his passionate defense of French culture as inspiration for wanting to learn the language themselves. Cultural centers and museums experienced similar surges in interest. The French Cultural Center in New York reported record attendance at their events, with many visitors specifically mentioning Alain's television moment as what had motivated them to learn more about French culture and history. The interview also influenced how other European actors and artists approached their American media appearances. Many began insisting on the right to speak in their native languages when discussing topics close to their hearts, following the precedent that Alain had established. British actors started incorporating more UK colloquialisms into their American interviews. Italian directors began speaking passionately in Italian about their films. Spanish performers refused to completely Americanize their names or speaking patterns. All of them cited Alain's example as giving them permission to remain authentic rather than conforming to what they thought American audiences wanted. The television industry itself began to evolve as well. Producers realized that subtitles, previously considered impossible for American television, could actually add rather than detract from the viewing experience. This gradual acceptance would eventually contribute to the later success of foreign films and television shows in the American market. Media critics wrote extensively about what they termed the authenticity revolution in American entertainment. Alain's moment was identified as a pivotal point when American audiences began demanding more genuine cultural experiences rather than homogenized, sanitized versions of international personalities. The interview also marked a turning point in how American television approached international celebrities. Producers learned that audiences were actually drawn to authenticity, even when it came packaged in unfamiliar languages or cultural references. Social movements also embraced Alain's words. Civil rights organizations used Je suis français et alors as a template for their own declarations of cultural pride. African American groups adapted it to Je suis noir et alors, I am black, so what? Hispanic communities created their own version, Soy Latino, y qué, I am Latino, so what? The phrase became a symbol of resistance against cultural assimilation pressure that extended far beyond language issues. It represented the right to maintain distinctive cultural practices, to celebrate different holidays, to prepare traditional foods, and to pass cultural knowledge to the next generation without apologizing for being different. Universities began incorporating Alain's television moment into their diversity and inclusion curricula. Students studying sociology, anthropology, and cultural studies watched the interview as an example of how individual acts of cultural assertion could influence broader social attitudes. The business world also took notice. Companies with international operations began reconsidering their policies about cultural expression in the workplace. Some began encouraging employees to share their cultural backgrounds rather than suppressing them in the name of corporate uniformity. Decades later, the moment remains one of the most powerful examples of how a single phrase, delivered with conviction at the right moment, can transcend language barriers and speak directly to universal human experiences of dignity, identity, and the right to remain true to oneself. The interview continues to be referenced in discussions about immigration, multiculturalism, and cultural preservation. When politicians debate bilingual education or when communities resist pressure to abandon their cultural traditions, Alain's 5 words are often invoked as a reminder that cultural identity is not something to be ashamed of or hidden away. The 5 words that Alain spoke that night, Je suis français et alors, proved that sometimes the most profound statements are also the simplest. In refusing to hide who he was, he gave millions of people permission to embrace who they were. If this incredible story of cultural pride and authentic identity inspired you, make sure to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their heritage is something to celebrate, not hide. Tell us in the comments about a moment when you chose to embrace your identity rather than suppress it for others' comfort, because sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply refuse to apologize for who we are.